Epicurus. Very few people throughout history have had movements named after them. Even fewer have movements named after them that have come to represent the very opposite of what they stood for. One such man was the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. During his lifetime, Epicurus taught that pleasure was the chief purpose of life, and the way to achieve it was to cultivate such qualities as self-control, courage, and judiciousness. Today, however, Epicureanism represents excessive, lustful living and an eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die attitude. To find out how a man's life's purpose could become so warped by history, let's take a closer look at the man who was Epicurus. Epicurus was born on the tiny island of Samos, just off the coast of Asia Minor, in 341 BCE. His parents were recent immigrants from Athens. The family was not very wealthy and had moved to Samos to take up an offer of free land. Epicurus' father, Neocles, found work as a schoolteacher. The boy was taught by his father during his formative years. Then, at around the age of 10, he began to study under the tutelage of philosophers Amphilus and Nausiphanes. From these teachers, young Epicurus picked up the ideas of two of the great philosophical minds of the day, Plato and Democritus, of who his teachers were disciples. Among the ideas that the eager young mind absorbed were the atomist teachings of Democritus, which held that cheerfulness was a fundamental and important state of being, and that the universe may contain other life-containing planets. In his late teens, Epicurus underwent 2 years of compulsory military training. It was during this period of army service that his family were forcibly relocated from Samos to the Ionian city of Colophon. This move was imposed upon all Athenians living in Samos by Perdiccas, the loyal sidekick to Alexander the Great, who became commander-in-chief of the Greek army after the death of Alexander in 321 BCE. It was after his military service, and during the time that he accustomed himself to his new home at Colophon, that Epicurus began to develop his own unique philosophy. From as early as 14 years of age, he had shown frustration and doubt in the teaching of his tutors. He believed that knowledge could not be imparted to him by others. It had to come from one's own experience through the senses. By the time he was in his early 20s, Epicurus had established the essence of his belief system. The purpose of life was to maximize one's pleasure and minimize pain. But his was far from a hedonistic view. He advocated abstemiousness in all things, so that he indulged very moderately in things such as food and drink. Showing how he was content with very little, he famously said, "Send me a little pot of cheese, then, when I like, I may feast sumptuously." The cultivation of happiness, he believed, could best be achieved by a life that was free of wants, worries, and anxieties. As a result, he lived a life of moderation, temperance, and modesty in all things. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Epicurus began to develop a following on the basis of his teachings. Like a number of thinkers of the time, he opened a school of philosophy. But unlike most of the others, he welcomed all sorts of people, including women and slaves. This drew the ire of his fellow philosophical teachers, who held the view that philosophical teachings must be reserved for learned young men of a certain intellectual and social caliber. To teach it to women and slaves was, they believed, like throwing pearls to swine. As a result of his insistence on making his teachings available to all people, Epicurus was hounded by the established philosophical minds in Athens and elsewhere. As a result of this persecution, he was forced to relocate his school, first to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, and then to Lamascus on the eastern side of the strait between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara, known as the Hellespont. He set up schools at both places. In 306 BCE, at the age of 35, Epicurus moved to Athens, the philosophical centre of the ancient world. He purchased a property there that included a large garden. The school that he founded was named the Garden, and he met with his students in this open-air setting. The Garden soon set itself apart from the other philosophical schools in Athens, becoming more a community of like-minded people of a particular way of life than a school. It also admitted women as a rule rather than an exception. On a gate in the Garden hung the following inscription: "Stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here, our highest good is pleasure." Epicurus lived a long and contented life. He remained in Athens for the remainder of his 72 years, surrounded by his community of followers in the Garden. He was an extremely prolific writer, having penned as many as 300 volumes. Unfortunately, only a few small fragments have survived. Most of what we know of his life and teachings come from those who came after him. Epicurus did not marry and never fathered any children. It is also very likely that he was a vegetarian. His last months on earth were painful, the result of kidney stones that caused renal failure. Yet, despite being in excruciating pain, he remained in good spirits. He was surrounded by his beloved disciples. A few days before he died, he wrote the following: "On the happiest and the last day of my life, I am suffering from diseases of the bladder and intestines, which are of the utmost possible severity. Yet all my sufferings are counterbalanced by the contentment of soul, which I derive from remembering our reasonings and discoveries." Epicurus died in 270 BCE in Athens. Despite the agony of his last days, his philosophy of life, focusing on pleasure and contentment, allowed him to find happiness right to the very end. Following his death, the followers of Epicurus lived in small communities that were modelled on the Garden. In these communities, women and servants were treated as equals, something which was an extreme rarity in those days. In keeping with the teachings of their founder, they placed a high value on friendship. Epicurus himself had contended that the greatest blessing in human life was the possession of friendship, and that a man should be willing, if the situation merited it, to die on the behalf of his friend. The belief that Epicurus held about what would happen to him after he died was very different to the philosophies of Plato, Pythagoras, and the Stoics. He believed that death was the extinction of all life, and that the soul was nothing more than an amalgamation of atomic particles. He wrote the following: "Against all other things it is possible to obtain security. But when it comes to death, we human beings all live in an unwalled city." The teachings of Epicurus can be summed up in 3 statements relating to the desires of man. Firstly, there are natural desires that are essential to life, such as food, water, and shelter. He included friendship too, as one of these essential desires. Secondly, there are natural desires that we can live without, such as those for material possessions and indulgence in food and drink. These desires, he stated, cause strife, jealousy, and discontentment. Third, there are desires that are completely narcissistic, such as those for wealth and fame. These desires, if fed, will only lead to unhappiness. It is the controlled satisfying of the first desire, along with the subjection of the second and third desires, that, according to Epicurus, lead to real, long-lasting pleasure. Today, however, as we noted at the outset, the word Epicurean represents something very different to what its founder taught. The modern rendering of the word fixates on the idea of pleasure for its own sake. As a result, it brings to mind the idea of uncontrolled partying, orgies, and gluttony. It is safe to say, then, that Epicurus would not consider himself to be an Epicurean based on the modern understanding of the word. In fact, the sort of lifestyle that the word engenders is the exact opposite to what the man himself taught. It's just another one of the many ironies of history. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe. If you have any other suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover, please leave a comment below. and we'll see you next time on History Jungie.